In this video, I'll be running through why cutting ad spend isn't the solution to turning into profitability. The reason why I'm making this video is that 70% of the prospective clients that I audit have this exact issue. And they're in a position where they're either very marginally profitable or they're in the red. And they have to make the decision of, should we be cutting down advertising spend or should we be increasing it to improve the P&L and improve the profitability and the cash flow of the business moving forward in time? And in a lot of instances, the answer is not what they want to hear. And it's that you can't cut ad spend. And the reason for that fundamentally is because direct advertising and marketing for a direct-to-consumer brand is the demand lever that generates the top-line revenue. And so I'm going to be running through in this video the chicken or the egg scenario that so many direct-to-consumer founders go through, which is that they can only get through profitability to spend, but to spend, they need money. And so there's this constant cash flow issue. I'll run through some ways that you can approach resolving it, and then ultimately the solution to this issue in its simplest form. So on the screen right now, I have a real P&L. This is an actual business. And obviously it isn't a zero report. It's not all complicated with all the way the accounts are structured out. Instead, I've simplified it down to just demand at the top, which is gross revenue, discounts, returns, shipping. This is just a valuable in Shopify, which takes us down to net revenue. I've then imported COGS. This is directly from Shopify as well. Fulfillment and shipping. This is an assumption of a dollar value per unit. Transaction fees. This is also an assumption of 3% plus 30 cents per order. That takes us to gross. We then have direct advertising and marketing. For this particular brand, it's just Google and Facebook ads summed together here. That then takes us to contribution margin. We then minus off their operating expenses and we get down to EBITDA. And then I have all the percentages broken down the bottom here as well, so you can see the dynamics of the P&L. From here, the question then becomes that this brand, besides November, ends up losing money in most months. February was a different case because they had a particular product drop and they also ran a large discount. But normally they are in the red. You can see in September they lost 43, December 16, January they lost about $2,000. And so the question for this brand is, do we decrease advertising spend to then open up more contribution margin to then open up more EBITDA? This is ultimately the wrong question and it comes from the wrong framing. The question instead that you need to be asking is how much incremental gross revenue is being generated from each top line segment of spend. And so you can start to approach spend in incremental units rather than looking at as a blended figure, because it's not. And this is a common misconception with the approach to advertising spend and the approach to looking at a P&L really. Like an accountant will make this mistake, which is that you make the assumption based on the frame of thinking that I've given you so far, that $160,000 in spend here generates $822,000 in gross revenue. But that isn't necessarily true, okay? The first $20,000 of spend might generate $200,000 in revenue. And so the first 20K in spend might have an incredible ROI on it because you're targeting a very specific audience that's already super high intent. They've probably already heard of you before. And so they're going to convert and they're going to buy at really strong conversion rates, at really low average CPCs. And it's going to be incredibly efficient spend. But then as we layer on that second 20 grand and we go from 20 to 40, that second 20 might only be responsible for generating 150. And then the next 20 that we layer on might only generate 110. And so you start to have this diminishing of incremental revenue lift in proportion to incremental advertising spend that's placed into the media mix. There's also nuances between where that budget is placed. Are we going to get better incrementality from putting it on Meta versus Google? That's what you need to solve for. You need to get an understanding for, if we cut this 160 to 150, what is the expected loss in top line revenue? It might very much so be the case, and it usually is the case, that there is always wasted spend in the very top of the media mix as you break it down. And so generally speaking, 90% of brands could cut their advertising spend tomorrow by 10%, and it would make very little change to top line revenue. Does that mean that every brand watching this and every brand in the world right now should cut their spend by 10%? And the answer is no. The reason why the answer is no is because it doesn't solve the problem of how do we turn that top 10% into providing incremental lift. It's not just cut spend and then hope that it improves contribution margin at the bottom line with a relatively high degree of risk. It's how do we take existing spend and then make it incremental? Because it's only through making the existing advertising spend incremental that we can generate more contribution dollars, which covers operating expenses, which pushes us into profitability. And so, yes, as a short-term fix, you can generally cut marketing by 5 to 10%, and you should be okay. Because there probably isn't much incrementality on the top 10%. You're very, very often, you have wasted efficiency in media spend. But that's an issue to solve for. That's not an issue to cut. You need to solve for making the top 10% incremental rather than just cutting it out. It will it'll provide you with an extra, in this instance, it'll provide you with about an extra $15,000 in profit contribution per month. And so yes, that will get these figures slightly improved, but it won't fix the problem, which is that even if these guys did cut advertising spend by 10% tomorrow and they saw no dip in top line revenue, it would take them to break even, or it would take them to 2% EBITDA, 3% EBITDA. I don't think anyone ever started a business, particularly a direct-to-consumer business, that was doing $500,000 a month in revenue and thought, I want to run this at 3% EBITDA. I don't think that's anyone's goal ever. And so if that's not your goal, if that's not what you're building the systems towards as an outcome, then cutting 10% of ad spend is not going to get you to 15, 20, 25% EBITDA. What is being able to effectively provide incremental returns on layering more advertising spend in while simultaneously not increasing OpEx. If they kept operating expenses stable and they were able to effectively increase advertising spend, getting incremental lift on revenue, that is what turns this business into running on 15, 20, 25% EBITDA. And that's what you see in November. This is the exact dynamics of what occurs for most brands during November. You ask the question, why did they make so much money in November compared to these other months? And you could make a very arbitrary statement and just say that it's because they spent more. But it's more specifically because they generated more contribution dollars, which covered operating expenses, which provided this flow through into EBITDA. And so once this brand gets past $85,000 in contribution margin, their percentage EBITDA starts to go up linearly. Whereas comparatively, when they're sitting around this level, their operating expenses as a percentage of revenue is just so incredibly high. And so the point I was trying to get at there, even though I weaved around trying to get to it, was the fact that the reason why November is so profitable is because OpEx goes down as a percentage. It's because OpEx drops from 20% to 10%. And where does that 10% differential go? Straight into EBITDA. So anytime you can democratize operating expenses as a proportion of top line revenue, you're going to see this wide opening in net profitability. And the only way that that's achieved, the only way that you pull operating expenses down as a percentage of gross revenue, is that you are super diligent in controlling the inflation of operating expenses as the business grows, which I would say 90% of direct-to-consumer founders are terrible at. It's very easy as you start to see revenue numbers grow, as you start to see cash flow in and out of a bank account start to grow. You have this correlated expectation that there should be more staff, that there should be bigger warehousing, that you should be investing in future projected growth targets. The issue is that if you don't hit those projected growth targets, if someone comes in and starts competing with you and costs go up, you now get left in a position where operating expenses are so high as a percentage of revenue that you can never take into profitability. And this is the rat race that I mentioned at the start. This is the chicken before the egg, which is that most brands, because they load up their operating expenses, the only way that they can cover OpEx is by spending more on ads to generate more revenue profitably, which turns into more contribution dollars, which can cover the OpEx. The issue is that when you load up on OpEx and you turn your business into this kind of scenario, you don't have any cash available to spend more on ads. And so the only way to fix the business is to spend more on ads in a profitable way that's going to drive efficient returns, but you can't spend more. And so what do? how do you get the cash? And so you often end up needing to go into a situation where you need to finance advertising spend through going into a debt cycle on a credit card, for example, which can often help propel you out of this situation. But once you're in that situation, people just never end up leaving because they end up in a position where they realize they can just finance their way through marketing dollars, which then spirals them back into the same situation that they started. And so they go from a worse situation, they improve it through using a financial tool, and then that financial tool, they never get rid of it. And so they end up in an even worse position back where they started, but now they're leveraged. It's really important to be cognizant of this cycle that I see so many direct-to-consumer brands go through. If you work at an agency and you're watching this video, which I know most of the people that watch these videos are, you need to be really cognizant of this as well, because this is likely what probably half of the businesses you're working with, this is the situation that they're in. You go, we need to increase ad spend to generate more revenue, and they go, we can't increase ad spend. And you go, why? And they go, there's not enough cash flow. And you go, but like, how? Because we're operating here at a 5.5 MER. We know your cost of delivery is 50%. We should be spitting out a lot of contribution dollars here, right? We should be spitting out 60, 70, 80, $90,000 in contribution dollars. But you don't realize that their operating expenses equals that contribution dollar mark. And so they're outputting no new cash flow within the business to then incrementally put into advertising spend to grow top line to cover those operating expenses. And in fact, as they continue to increase advertising expenses, they'll just increase OPEX proportionally. And so this number, contribution margin, OPEX, will often just end up equaling each other forever. They just grow OPEX as they grow contribution dollars to be able to cover that OPEX. It takes a really strong operator to be able to control this figure and actually push the business into profitability. And so having visibility on operating expenses as a partner who's trying to drive better financial outcomes is an absolute necessity, or else you don't know where the frontier of contribution dollars lies for you to break into profitability and where you can start going exponential in terms of returns.